I think it's safe to say that the final battle is about to commence after the end of episode 9 of Ice Queendom. Everyone has gathered and things are getting pretty intense. But before I get into that, I will say spoiler warning for those who have not seen episode 9 of Ice Queendom. I will not be showing the episode or any clips from it in this video, simply images of the episode and analyzing the events that take place. I'll leave links in the description below so you guys can go to either Rooster Teeth First or Crunchyroll, watch the series there, and support this amazing show. Now, the series itself starts off within RWBY's dream, as we kind of expected given the end of last episode, as RWBY fell victim to the nightmare. However, it is very different than what I was expecting, at least. We find RWBY asleep in her dorm room, in the bunk beds that she made with the rest of her team, being woken up by Weiss, who's handing her coffee, mimicking the scene from earlier in the season. Except there's one very key difference here. Her bed is covered in the thorns of the nightmare. This is within RWBY's dream, and the Weiss that RWBY is talking to isn't a figment of her imagination. This is the real Weiss, unaffected by the nightmare, her true feelings talking to RWBY. Now that RWBY had fallen asleep within Weiss's dream, and Weiss already being asleep, apparently this allows them to communicate. A little bit of anime logic in my mind, considering RWBY is completely unaffected by the nightmare and she's still lucid, though that could also be an effect of Jaune's immunity, considering the sword and Jaune are right next to her, she's lying unconscious. It could be a combination of things, but allowing RWBY to communicate with the real Weiss, I am assuming, is because RWBY fell asleep within Weiss's dream. And through the conversation that they have, we find that Weiss does in fact trust RWBY, that RWBY had actually caused a little bit of trouble since she let out all of the things that Weiss was trying to keep locked up. RWBY expressing that she wanted Weiss to be more free, and Weiss shares that sentiment. She wants to be able to let them out, and is a bit jealous of RWBY's free nature, even expressing that she understands where Yang is coming from, even though she does berate Yang often for spoiling RWBY. But Weiss is also expressing that there should be a little bit of a middle ground. In my mind, she's saying that she does want to be more free, but also not as free and reckless as RWBY. She does berate her a little bit from that, but she does specifically say that she trusts RWBY, and also states that she never thought she'd meet someone lonelier than herself, implying that RWBY is lonelier than Weiss. Because after Weiss says this, RWBY gets a flashback to when she was standing at her mother's grave, implying that RWBY herself is very lonely as well, which is something I can completely understand given how close RWBY was to her mother, and that loss still weighing on her so many years later. But the sentiment also confuses me a little bit, because RWBY has not only her sister Yang, but also her father Tai and Crow to care for her. All of her family also suffered with that loss. Now, it's entirely possible that Crow and Tai weren't really that open to discussing it with RWBY. We actually saw a hint of that in the RWBY comics that were released a couple years back, that Tai really wasn't opening up to his daughters about Summer. And even in Volume 5, when Yang and Tai were sparring, and the topic of Raven was brought up, Yang was surprised that she was actually able to talk about that with Tai now, implying that Tai really didn't talk about his past adventures with Raven, and likely also Summer, probably trying to keep things close to the chest given the mission that Summer likely went on and the information that all of Team Stark had. So I can easily understand why RWBY is so lonely, and why Weiss does kind of see her as a kindred spirit, though I would kind of think that Weiss might be a little bit more lonely, considering she's been isolated pretty much her entire life, given the way that her father treats her, that her mother is absent, that Winter took off, and she can really find no solace in her brother either. But at the end of it all, I'm just an outside observer. It's arguing apples to oranges, which is more lonelier, and it's all a matter of perception. Both of them are suffering with their own loneliness, and that is put on full display, something that I hope might be explored in the next 3 episodes. After this, RWBY brings up that her crescent rose is actually backwards, that the barrel's supposed to point out to the other end, and the real Weiss exclaims that there is a reason for that. Apparently there's a reason why RWBY's weapon is backwards, something that we'll find out later, and something that RWBY questions even later in this very episode. She looks at her gun and is asking, okay, there's another reason for this? as we've seen thus far in the dream, with the amount of symbolism and representation that is in Ice Queendom of Weiss's inner feelings, everything seems to have a reason behind it. And although we thought we knew the reason why Crescent Rose was backwards, because Weiss just didn't really pay that much attention, there should be a deeper reason to that, something that will be revealed a little bit later on. And I'm curious as to what that's going to be, because right now I really have no idea. Weiss then starts walking off, saying that she needs to go to the place where she is going to sleep. RWBY bids farewell to her, and the thorns start to consume her, meaning that the nightmare is about to take hold, and RWBY would likely be subjected to the same type of dream that Weiss is subjected to. We then cut to the real world, and Jaune is realizing that they're in a bit of a dire situation. Jaune's trying to wake RWBY up, but their abilities aren't really working. We can see the keyboard typing frantically, wake, 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 nothing's working. Something is interfering with Jaune's capabilities, that being the nightmare currently infecting RWBY. And this is when Jaune finally realizes that RWBY is infected with a nightmare. I still think that Jaune should have realized this earlier on, given that RWBY was scratched by the thorns. Maybe that was something that RWBY didn't express to Jaune at that time when they had been kicked out of the dream for the second time. But given that Jaune is a nightmare hunter, probably had experience with this before, and specifically warned RWBY, Blake, and Yang not to touch the thorns, I feel like Jaune should have known, given that RWBY, from being in a dream, suffered a real injury to her hand. I really think that this is something that Jaune should have known. Either way though, the situation is dire at this point, and there's not really anything Jaune can do. But although Jaune can't do anything, there is someone who can, as we see Jaune's aura start to spike in the real world. Cutting back to the dream, we see that he is actually lifting RWBY up to the sword, getting her closer to the object that drives away the nightmare. And while he's doing this, the tiny Weisses are cheering him on, which is absolutely adorable, and as Jaune does get RWBY right next to the sword, the nightmare recedes. The ice that was beginning to form around her hand starts to melt, the thorns of the nightmare dissipate, and then RWBY woke up. She reached into her pocket as she saw her last coin glowing, and it disappeared. So what actually happened here is that the nightmare was interfering with Jaune's abilities. What Jaune was trying to do was use one of RWBY's coins to wake her up. But with Jaune's help, by weakening the effect of the nightmare by bringing RWBY closer to the sword, Jaune's abilities were able to take effect, and RWBY was now freed from the nightmare. Temporarily. She was freed from her sleep, but we see later in the episode that the nightmare is still infecting her, so that's going to have to be dealt with at some point in the next 3 episodes. Maybe we'll get a chance to delve further into RWBY's dream, because we really didn't get that much of a chance to at this point. We know that RWBY was suffering with a lot of insecurities, and it seems a lot of those worries were put at bay given the conversation that RWBY had with Weiss inside of her dream, but I still think there's a lot more that could be explored, but we'll have to wait and see. Back in the real world, Jaune doesn't know what happened, but realizes that RWBY is now out of danger, and Ozpin inquires about Jaune's semblance, asking the rest of Team Juniper what exactly his semblance does. I feel like that's something maybe the headmaster of the academy should know about his students, that it would probably be included in their transcripts or something like that, what their abilities might be. I don't know. I know that a lot of characters keep their semblances and their abilities kind of a close-kept secret, especially Pyrrha, given that she's known as the untouchable girl. She doesn't want everyone to know that she has the ability of polarity, but I feel like the headmaster of the academy would not want to know what each of the students are capable of. And the response that Team Juniper gives is that they have no idea. In fact, Jaune was only just able to start using his aura. And I really feel like Team Juniper kind of just threw Jaune under the bus here, because he faked his transcripts to get into the academy. I know the Jaundice episodes weren't actually shown in Ice Queendom, but canonically, they still happened by this point. So Pyrrha should know that Jaune didn't actually get into the academy, that everything said on his transcript is fake. And I feel like, given what we've seen in the RWBY series thus far, at least in the original Volume 1, that Glinda made a comment during the Beacon initiation that I don't care what his transcript says, that his abilities don't seem quite up to par. Well, This would kind of prove that to Ozpin. I have a feeling that Ozpin kind of knew that Jaune faked his transcripts and allowed him in anyways, because notably, Glinda is not here during this scene. I feel like she may have had something to say about Jaune not even having his aura at this point, but I really feel like Team Juniper kind of threw Jaune under the bus. It's possible that Ren and Nora didn't know at this point that Jaune had faked his transcripts. We know by Volume 8, Ren calls Jaune out on it, that he faked his way into Beacon, so they do learn about it at some point. I would figure that it would probably be while they were studying at Beacon Academy, given how close Team Juniper is and the trust they have for one another, but it might have been sometime later, perhaps when Jaune was traveling with the rest of Team Ranger, or something like that. And I know I'm getting off topic, but this just really stood out to me that they blatantly said, yeah, Jaune really had no experience. He only just got his aura, so who knows what his semblance can actually do. Right to the headmaster that, you know, he gave fake transcripts to get into the school. Either way, though, after this, Ozpin says something very interesting. That sometimes through battle, one can awaken powers hidden deep within themselves. You know, implying that Jaune might be able to awaken his semblance during this battle. Which definitely would be a break from canon, but when Ozpin said this, it was looking at RWBY, implying that the Silver Eyes might actually play a factor in Ice Queendom as well. They did specifically include the scene where Ozpin mentioned RWBY's Silver Eyes in Episode 1, the iconic scene from Episode 1 of the original RWBY series as well. When Ozpin first sees RWBY, he notices her silver eyes. So, you know, the Silver Eyes might actually play a factor here. I honestly really hope that they don't, given that it would be a pretty big break from canon and wouldn't really make logical sense, but we'll see how things play out in Ice Queendom. I made an entire video yesterday on this very topic, but, you know, I won't get into that here. You can watch that video if you're interested. After this, we get a look into Weiss's inner sanctum. As she's staring at the coffin once again, she realizes that RWBY fell asleep, and wonders if Blake and Yang and everyone else fell asleep as well. She then begins singing Mirror, Mirror, talking about, of course, how she's the loneliest of all. And while she's singing this song, we see her looking at a reflection of herself, the real Weiss. And then we see the tiny Weisses appear behind Nightmare Weiss, and they seem to be getting absorbed into her. And then the same is true of the real Weiss, her reflection, and all that remains is Nightmare Weiss. As she finishes singing the song, saying, "I'm the loneliest of all," the coffin opens up and the thorns wrap around her, pulling her inside. The coffin then closes and the room begins to freeze. This scene very much implying that Nightmare Weiss may have in fact absorbed the other aspects of Weiss and has now fallen into true sleep, eternal rest within the coffin. And then we cut over to see what's happening in the Faunus funhouse, I guess, as things are kind of pretty chaotic in there. There's a model train hanging from the ceiling, there seems to be Grimm, there's puppets, there's all sorts of things that just seem chaos and cluttered within this mansion. Blake had jammed the door, Bashful Klein, with her weapon so that they'd be able to get out, and as they're exploring around, they express how chaotic it is in here, that perhaps this is a place where things go when there's nowhere else for them to go. We also see that there is a bunk bed. This is where Weiss's sentiment of wanting bunk beds seems to have gone, even though when we saw the jail cell with Sleepy Klein that both RWBY and Yang were in, well, it was like the Beacon dorms. The bunk beds were there as well, so I'm curious why they're represented here, locked away with the Faunus. Perhaps a duality of something that Weiss holds precious, that she wants to keep close to herself, as well as something she wants to keep distant from herself, locking it away with Blake and the Faunus. As Yang and Blake head deeper into the mansion, they find a door with the White Fang symbol on it. Not the current White Fang symbol, though. The previous White Fang symbol when the White Fang was controlled by Gira. Both Blake and Yang go into this room, and it seems to be the room that Blake is supposed to reside in, as at its center there is another one of those confusing signs, and the black relic is positioned in the middle of it. So unfortunately, that first sign that we saw on the outskirts of the kingdom seems to just be our first introduction to the sign and doesn't really seem to hold any other significance. I really thought it would have been fitting to have Blake's relic buried under there, but instead they put it in this mansion, locked behind one of the Kleins, which does make sense. Each of the 3 Kleins that were represented as doors, Bashful, Sleepy, and Dopey, were each protecting one of the relics, one of the keys to Weiss's heart. So I guess that is pretty fitting that Weiss put Klein in charge of guarding them. Though I'm still curious what this other sign that's out in the middle of the white tundra would represent, other than just Weiss's confusion in the outer world, because the only other times we've seen those signs are protecting the relics. I would hope that maybe this sign would have something else significant about it as well, but still, this room that is meant to be Blake's is missing one key thing. We see a bookshelf that is there, and on the shelf is The Man with Two Souls. If this was truly meant to be Blake's room, I know Rooster Teeth and the writers of Ice Queendom have included a lot of callbacks to the original series, and I feel like they missed one at this point. They could have easily included one other book that would have been a nice nod to the original series. One that Blake kind of keeps hidden from everyone else. The Ninjas of Love. Had that book been sitting there right next to The Man with Two Souls, that would have been fantastic. Would have laughed so hard at that, but then again, given that this scene is supposed to be kind of dire and solemn, they're in a pretty serious situation, I understand why they didn't include it there, though it would have been a nice nod to the original series. Yang grabs the relic and the sign begins to change, just like how it did in the Silly's jail, except this time the arrows of the sign begin to flip over, showing the symbol of the white fang. And as it does so, it seems this relic was holding back something else. In the Silly's jail, it was the tiny Weisses, and here it is the grim monsters of the White Fang. Both Blake and Yang run out into the hallway as they hear the monsters growl, and they see them prowling around, though they are quite tame, and Yang is curious as to why. Blake realizes that it's probably because she is there, that Weiss views Blake the same as the other White Fang members, as the rest of the Faunus. Yang tries to reassure her that that's not true, but Blake says that she understands, given how she once used to think, that all of the people who oppressed the Faunus she thought of as dangerous and as enemies, that helped her justify fighting against them. And Weiss feels the same way, that all of the Faunus are enemies. And I think it is truly all of the Faunus, not just the White Fang. Even though the White Fang are represented here, this is where all of the Faunus are supposed to be locked away in Weiss's dream, and all of them are the White Fang. So I think this is really telling on how Weiss feels inside. But Blake also mentions that deep down she had always known that all of them weren't evil, that it's not true about every individual. And Weiss realizes that too, most likely represented in Blake's overall appearance, that one of her ears is covered by a ribbon, one of them isn't. So there is that kind of hesitation there to see Blake as one of all of the other Faunus. At this point, Yang just wants to barge ahead now that they have the relic. She goes to try to create another door with one of her coins so that they can just go and defeat the nightmare, but Blake stops her. Given that this is Volume 1 Yang, brute force is always her answer, but it's not always the correct answer. Blake, being the reasonable one, points out that, the last time we tried that, Nightmare Weiss just whooped our butts. We can't get past her. We can't defeat her. She's too strong. And Blake seems to have another idea. But before we get to see what that idea is, we go back over to RWBY, Jaune, Pyrrha, and the tiny Weisses on the train. RWBY is scouting out the surroundings and seeing that everything around them has stopped moving. The Shadow People, Whitley, everything has stopped moving. We know this is because Weiss has put herself to sleep inside of the coffin, but RWBY at this point doesn't know that Weiss is asleep. Jaune, meanwhile, is trying the doors, trying to get to a door that is close to Weiss's inner sanctum, but all of them have been blocked off by the nightmare. And we also see what happened to Ren, Nora, and the other tiny Weisses. They have been frozen in place, put into stasis by the nightmare. They better still be able to be saved, and realistically we know that they will be, considering, the RWBY series continues after this point with Weiss as a main character, but it's still Really sad to see the tiny Weisses in this state, as well as Ren and Nora, of course. As they regroup and share what they've found, RWBY wants to go ahead and try to get to the central building. Now that everything has stopped moving, RWBY wants to just push ahead as well. Similar to Yang, we can easily tell that they're sisters in this scenario, and Jaune is the reasonable one, standing in the way saying, look, what if more soldiers show up? We don't have any more coins. We can't afford to act recklessly. And so RWBY pauses for a moment and tries to come up with a plan to not act recklessly. And the plan that she comes up with is to try to use the train that they are on to get to the central tower as a way of distraction so that there can be more time for Blake and Yang to arrive. I think Jaune is being more reasonable here, saying that they should just wait for Blake and Yang, all regroup, and then try something together, because there's no guarantee, really, that their distraction is going to last long enough for Blake and Yang to arrive. Of course, you know, the plot will allow their distraction to last long enough until they do, but, you know, realistically, they don't know how long they will be able to last against Nightmare Weiss. Still, that's the plan that RWBY wants to go with. After having talked with the real Weiss, she knows that she's able to move around freely, and that if she is able to move the train, then that means Weiss likely isn't asleep yet. Which, at this point, we do know that Weiss is asleep, which is something I'll address in a moment. Jaune then asks RWBY if she's going to let the tiny Weisses fight as well, pointing out what happened last time, that they went on a rampage, that they turned into monsters and started attacking them as well. And RWBY then counters, saying that, well, Pyrrha was with you the entire time, and she didn't go berserk, and RWBY has a different idea. She realizes that it was probably because she told them all to fight for freedom that they kind of went on that rampage. This time, she's going to ask the tiny Weisses to fight for Weiss, which will mostly keep them under control. RWBY's reasoning for this is that she wants to selfishly let the tiny Weisses fight because she wants Weiss to be more free, and she wants to help Weiss realize that she wants to get out of this dream as well. Something that I mentioned in my video yesterday, that the ideal way for Ice Queendom to end would be to snap Weiss out of it within the dream, and then all of them can fight against the Nightmare together, because it was Nightmare Weiss that was always standing in their way. If they can get Nightmare Weiss on their side, especially with the power that she has, the fight against the Nightmare would be a lot easier. And it looks like that's the direction it will go in, as even though Nightmare Weiss was asleep, well, she just seems to wake up and then walk out of the coffin like nothing happened. This was quite jarring to me, actually, given the emotion that was going on with Weiss singing Mirror, Mirror, seeing the reflection of herself being absorbed into Nightmare Weiss, and then her being drawn into the coffin. And then she just walks out of it like nothing happened, just, oh, what's going on now? That seemed really jarring. Coffins are meant to be a symbol of finality, the final resting place, and yet Weiss can just enter one, be surrounded by thorns, which, by the way, resting in a coffin full of thorns would be extremely uncomfortable, but she's just able to walk out of it like nothing happened. That really seemed jarring to me, but we'll see what ends up happening. Considering that Weiss was singing Mirror, Mirror, and the last line of the song is I'm the loneliest of all, I'm wondering if this coffin isn't actually meant for Weiss herself, given that earlier in the episode, when the real Weiss was talking to RWBY within her dream, it was mentioned that RWBY is lonelier than Weiss. So in fact, Weiss isn't the loneliest of all. It's implying that it might be RWBY. So is RWBY going to end up in this coffin at some point? Like, things are getting a little bit confusing here, and I don't know how things are going to turn out, but I'm excited to see what comes in the next episodes. Back to this episode, though, the reason why Weiss woke up is because the train had now started moving. RWBY had gotten control of it and were now making their way through the upper city, dodging out of the way of the enemies that were standing there. The soldiers were trying to fire on the train, but given that it's an armored train, they weren't really doing much good. RWBY was sniping from the top of it, and the tiny Weisses, as well as Pyrrha, who was wielding one of the tiny Weisses' Mirtanasters, were firing shots off, taking out the soldiers that were standing in their path. Given that this is a dust cargo train, they had plenty of dust ammunition and could refill at will. They had essentially unlimited ammo for their task ahead, so they could just fire away and not worry about running out. The train is able to make it almost all the way to the tower, but Nightmare Weiss stands in their way, sending the Armagigas to stop the train while she uses her glyphs to freeze it to the tracks, stopping it in place. And then the battle begins. RWBY jumps off the train to go to clash with Nightmare Weiss, while the tiny Weisses and Pyrrha distract the Armagigas and keep its focus, as well as the rest of the soldiers, on the train to allow RWBY to fight and ideally get past Nightmare Weiss to go attack the Nightmare. However, this plan works about as well as you'd think it would, given their past experiences. Nightmare Weiss wipes the floor with RWBY, and unfortunately, while the soldiers are attacking the train, there are a few casualties. A number of the tiny Weisses do get struck. They take bullets to the chest and go down. You know, we're getting real close to rioting here. They better be okay after this point. We've seen tiny Weisses frozen and taken by the Nightmare, and then we've seen them gunned down in this episode. And on top of that, the Armagigas is able to jump on top of the train, pull the sword that was protecting them all out of it, and toss it aside like it was a toothpick. And the Nightmare rises up and is encroaching on all of them. So, really, their distraction didn't last all that long. The plan honestly wasn't that great. But, of course, the plot must move forward, and help does arrive. As Weiss is towering over RWBY, about to, likely land the final blow, the ground starts to shake and the rumbling begins. Well, not actually the rumbling, that would be a little bit too much Attack on Titan, but the sky does begin to crack and shatter, opening a portal to the mansion. And from that hole in the sky, the Faunus rain down and start attacking the kingdom's soldiers. Weiss is obviously in shock by this. Inside the train, Jaune, Pyrrha, and the 5 tiny Weisses that are left, there were 10 at the beginning of this episode, so half of them were gunned down. Very upsetting. They have no idea what's going on. As the Nightmare is encroaching on them, the door opens up and Yang bursts through, riding Bumblebee, and also wearing Jaune's cloak. Something else I mentioned in the video yesterday, that they might happen to find Jaune's cloak and bring it with them. So this cloak is probably going to be relevant as well, similar to the sword, and we'll see how much Jaune's immunity plays a role in all of this. The last thing that we see in the episode is one last person jumping from this hole in the sky. Blake jumps down and attacks Weiss in a completely new appearance, fully embracing her role in Weiss's dream as the leader of the White Fang. She has new weapons, has new clothes that, you know, at first I thought, like, oh my god, she's dressed like Raven, but no, she's actually dressed similar to Adam. She's wearing the same suit with the inner red lining and has Adam's mask over her face. She's no longer wearing the ribbon hiding one of her ears. She has fully embraced her Faunus heritage. And as she attacks Weiss, she says to her, "Faunus or human, I will show you who is superior and just." And this is where the episode ends. The final battle is absolutely going to commence next episode, and things are getting pretty wild. Now, a couple things, as I've mentioned throughout this review, don't exactly make sense. The gravity of the situation as Weiss was walking into the coffin, only for her to just walk out of it like nothing happened, I feel like that kind of takes away the seriousness of Weiss entering the coffin in the first place, and takes away some of the, you know, emotional impact of Weiss singing Mirror, Mirror. But we'll see if the coffin plays an even greater role later on, if someone else is meant to end up in it, or something like that. And then this hole in the sky that the Faunus were able to enter from. I have no idea how that makes sense. They wouldn't be able to create that hole in the sky using one of Xion's coins, because they created a door for Yang to get back, but all of the Faunus were able to break the hole in the sky and attack Weiss, and attack, well, the kingdom in general. So I think that that was an ability built into the dream by the Faunus, or by Weiss's feelings of the Faunus, that the Faunus are the only ones who can truly disrupt Weiss's kingdom, that they are the ones able to invade. And when Blake takes charge, she was able to get that ability, or something like that. Maybe that was an effect of the relic that they found within the mansion. Maybe Blake actually used that relic to break the hole in the sky, disrupt the dream, and also give herself that new appearance as she took on the role of leader of the White Fang. A lot of interesting symbolism and representation in this episode. Some things make sense, others really don't, and it does seem to be deviating more and more from canon given that Jaune's semblance was brought up already, as well as the possibility of the Silver Eyes being used. Two things that don't happen until later in the series. So although Ice Queendom was written to be canon adjacent, we'll see how true that is by the end of it. All in all, an excellent episode that really does keep us on our toes and wondering what's going to happen next. This series has had a lot of twists and turns, and it's really hard to predict as someone who likes making theory videos, but that's also an excellent thing as it opens up so many different possibilities for things to come. And I can't wait to see how it all unfolds. How about all of you? Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below on this episode and the things shown in it. Do some things also not really make sense to you, or can you rationalize things that I'm not able to see at this point? I would really love to know what your thoughts are on a number of these different scenes, on the coffin, the conversation that RWBY had with Weiss within her own dream, that she was able to talk to the real Weiss, Blake's new appearance, taking on a resemblance of Adam, and also the new weapons that she has kind of look pretty badass as well. I really hope they do show that fight in the next episode more than just, you know, quick flashes here and there. I hope we actually get to see the full fight of it, because that's going to be insane to see. And I'm curious to know who's actually going to end up winning. You'd think, given what we've seen, that Nightmare Weiss would be the strongest in her own dream, but with Blake taking on the role of the one who can disrupt Weiss's kingdom, she might be on an equal power level. This is going to be an interesting fight for sure, and I'd love to know who you think would win as well. If you guys enjoyed this video, want to see more of Ice Queendom, more of the RWBY series in general, make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.